Welcome, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and you're watching Scope. In today's episode, we're going to start off by discussing Iran-US tensions, which of course seem to only be heating up, especially in the wake of those attacks that took place in Saudi Arabia on the oil facilities. Now, interestingly, while trying to make the case that things would be worse if the president had not withdrawn from the nuclear deal, Mike Pompeo obviously called it an enormous failure, that is the nuclear deal, but he also acknowledged that the crisis with Iran at the moment is a direct result of actions taken by Trump by walking away from that nuclear deal. So he sort of found himself in a trap there through his own words, A. And interestingly, during this and now heightened maximum pressure campaign and threats of war and strikes on Iran, possibly being spoken of by U.S. officials, anonymously at least, there's a poll that's come out which says only 13% of Americans would actually support the U.S. Taking part in any conflict as a response to alleged Iranian actions in the region, be it attacks on Saudi oil installations or otherwise. And we can talk about, of course, the issue in the Strait of Hormuz and otherwise to oil tankers and others. Let's discuss all of that a bit further with our expert panelists who are joining us now. Joining us from New York is Mucerino, who is an independent analyst of international affairs. He also focuses, of course, on the Middle East. We're also joined from Cyprus by Alexandros, Zachariades, who is a PhD researcher in international relations at the London School of Economics. And finally, we're joined from London by Hamid Alkifaey, who is a writer and academic. Hamid, Alexandros, and Nicholas, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Nicholas, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of Pompeo's essentially admission that all of this tension that we're seeing in this region is really because the U.S. chose to walk away from that nuclear deal?
Well, Waqar, what I would say that it's a bit of a surprise that Mr. Pompeo would openly admit to that, considering the amount of pressure that he's on now with the absence of National Security Advisor John Bolton to simultaneously carry out the president's will while also maintaining a openly hawkish stance towards the Iranian government. As a congressman, Pompeo himself was particularly harsh when it came to matters related to Iran, but now he has to serve a boss who, while will speak very harshly to the regime in Tehran, wants to pursue a diplomatic option and avoid war with the country at the same time. And you see that in that Pompeo on the way to Jeddah and Saudi Arabia openly declared the attack on Saudi Arabia an act of war, but then ultimately ended up saying that the United States would be seeking to return to the diplomatic route and trying to cast Iran as actually the aggressor rather than the U.S.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, Hamid, what your thoughts are on that, because if we are looking at the situation objectively, it is the U.S. walking away from that 2015 nuclear deal that has caused and heightened tensions in the Middle East region, isn't it?
Yes, that's true, actually. The thing is that Trump said right from the beginning that he's going to focus on America, and his motto in the election was America first. And suddenly he started venturing here and there. Walking away from the nuclear deal was a huge mistake, but it's understandable that he has chosen those hawks for his administration. The most senior are hawks like John Bolton, Pompeo, Mike Pence. And the advice of these people, they have always been critical of Iran. And obviously Iran is a problem in the region, but how to address this problem is not through threat or through walking away from agreement, which was an international agreement. The nuclear deal was an international agreement, and it was supported by a UN resolution. So walking away from that deal was a problem, not only for the U.S., but for the rest of the world. And when you put Iran in a corner, you don't expect Iran to just wait until it dies, because
Exactly.
the sanctions that Iran is now under are perhaps the harshest in history. So Iran is going to respond, and it has responded, and I'm sure the attacks on Saudi Arabia, on oil tankers, were either Iranian, directly Iranian actions, or they were, or Iran was behind them. So it is expected of Iran to start to retaliate. Because it is under pressure. The country is really suffocating.
Okay,
and,
so let me put those points that you made there, Hamid, to Alexandros as well. I wonder where your thoughts are on that, because, again, many people would say that, as Hamid there mentioned, that you can't just put Iran into a corner and expect it not to react in some way. If it is Iran that is behind all of the above actions in this region, is it understandable, and not justified possibly, but obviously understandable in the context of the fact that the U.S. walked away from the nuclear deal and then immediately initiated a campaign of maximum pressure?
Well, I think the first point to take away is that the action of the United States to walk away from the deal has brought up another round of the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia within the Middle East. And coupled with the fact that you have a campaign of maximum pressure going on between the United States and Iran, with the United States imposing sanctions that, while they say that they're supposed to bring back Iran to the negotiating table, I don't think that's the goal. That their goal will be regime change, ideally, in Iran. Well, it's quite understandable that Iran will have to respond somehow. The response, and their response has climaxed. So if you consider the fact that they have started to move away from the deal themselves in the previous summer, about a year ago, with the construction of new centrifuges and their willingness to enrich uranium for military purposes, something that they have publicly claimed, then there's a climax in their actions, which allegedly led to the attacks of last week. And another important fact to keep in mind is that 2020 is not only an election year in the United States, but it's also an election year in Iran itself, with the parliamentary elections coming up in February. So I would argue that the hardliners within the establishment in Iran, finding themselves in this current position, they will try to show force and strength as a way of rallying people to vote them. So that's also another factor that we have.
Yeah, so on that topic then of force and strength, interestingly, I'm going to go now to that poll, the Insider poll, which again shows just only 13% of Americans would want conflict with Iran, even in the wake of these attacks on the oil installations in Saudi Arabia, which many would say has not yet been proven, with complete evidence at this time. That's according to, of course, many experts around the world, not just myself. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? It seems that going into then these 2020 elections, I imagine the Trump administration must be taking that sort of public sentiment into account before it either heightens escalations or de-escalates, and possibly that meeting that's been spoken about between Rouhani and Trump possibly takes place on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. What are your thoughts?
The United States is weary of getting involved in another conflict with Iran. And in this case, you can see that the American public's attitudes are actually a reflection on Trump as much as Trump is a reflection on those attitudes. President Trump himself has openly made some very hawkish statements about the situation with Iran, derided the deal famously in 2015 as the worst deal of all time when it was negotiated under President Obama. But you do see him taking a similar diplomatic tact as his predecessor ahead of the UN General Assembly, keeping the door wide open for a meeting with the Iranians with no strings attached, in his words. And Pompeo, despite his hawkishness, is trying to toe that administration line. But keep in mind that the American public is also seeing this disjointedness of the administration's views on the topic. And on top of it, Trump is very likely aware and keeping the 2020 elections in mind, but also the attitudes of Congress, where when the Iranians shot down an American drone earlier this year, as you probably remember, there were Republicans who called for immediate retaliation, but then there were also skeptics such as Republican Senator Rand Paul, who insisted that the administration had no authority whatsoever to go to war with Iran in the first place.
Hamid, what are your thoughts about this poll? And I wanted to add on one more statistic when I put this question to you, Hamid. Not just only 13% of Americans would not support the U.S. joining conflict, but in fact 25% of them, or roughly 1 in 4, feel that the U.S. should in fact entirely remove itself from the affairs of the Middle East region. That's quite significant too, isn't it, Hamid?
Well, it has always been the case that people in any country do not want war, and they don't want to spend their resources, in faraway places over issues which they don't believe in. So this is understandable, and I think 25% is low. I would assume that most Americans wouldn't want America to go into war. With regard to Iran, I think the best solution is really engagement. And the Obama approach was right. And it really enhanced the position of the reformists in Iran. Trump's position has enforced and enhanced the position of the extremists. And this is not the way to go forward, because attacking Iran would attract the wrath of many people across the world, across the Muslim world at least. So it's a dilemma, and I think it was of Trump's own making. There was no need for all of that. America could have exerted more pressure on Iran and to enter into negotiations over its ballistic missiles.
Right.
And the Europeans would have helped in that, and Iran would have been a more normal country than it is now. But, this hawkish attitude is not going to solve the problem. The American people will not be amused and will not agree to a war in faraway places such as Iran.
Okay.
They didn't agree to the war in Afghanistan or Iraq. So it is understandable.
Okay, so we're just going to go into our first break. Gentlemen, do stay with us. We're going to be back with Nicholas, Alexandros, and Hamid. Viewers, stay with us. Thanks for remaining with us, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're continuing this discussion of Iran-U.S. tensions, especially, of course, within the context of the Middle East region and the attacks on those Saudi oil installations, allegedly, of course, committed by Iran. I'm going to go to Alexandros. Alexandros, going back to this poll, I wonder, again, I go back to the last statistics that I put to Hamid about the 25% of Americans who feel the U.S. should entirely remove itself from the affairs of the Middle East region. Do you think that would actually be a good thing if the U.S. were to walk away and allow regional players to engage, as Hamid there mentioned, engagement being important with Iran? That would be a good thing in many ways, wouldn't it? Where these regional countries would then be able to come to an understanding amongst themselves without any external influence either way.
Well, I think if one takes a look at the history of the Middle East itself, it would be quite utopic to believe that a region that has such an importance for the world's energy needs because of its oil and natural gas would suddenly see not only the United States but other global powers like China or Russia to completely remove themselves. If the United States would choose to do so, which I don't think it would mean that a huge gap of power will be left for someone to fill. And that gap would, I don't think that regional players, either Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Israel for that matter, can actually fill by themselves. It would have to be someone else that would come in and step in and take America's role, both in terms of fulfilling oil contracts, of providing security to certain seaways, or providing security to certain transport routes. And possibly one player would be China, if you consider the One Belt, One Road initiative, that actually Iran is one of the main players within that sort of scope. But I don't think that it would be a necessarily good thing, because when there is a gap of power, as we have seen in the case of post-Iraq war, Iraq and Syria, then it's a time where regional powers might be able to flex their muscle beyond their reach, which could lead to even more explosive situations.
Indeed. And, Nicholas, you're in New York right now itself. It seems pertinent to ask you this question, because it seems that the visas have now been issued for Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran, as well as the Iranian president, to be able to attend the UN General Assembly in that city. And as you know, there was great doubt about whether those visas would even be issued at this time of heightened tensions, and especially considering the foreign minister is now under U.S. sanctions, very strict U.S. sanctions himself. Is that in some way a sign, Nicholas, that the U.S. is sort of still playing very much this double game of hot and cold, where it says one day, that what Iran does is an act of war, it needs to be dealt with, and on the other hand, it says it's still willing to talk to Iranian leaders? Do you think that there's actually genuinely a possibility of the presidents of Iran and the U.S. meeting, even secretly, at the UN?
Well, Waqar, I would say that it does reflect the inconsistent, disjointed set of attitudes that define the Trump administration's approach to Iran. But it's interesting to note that Mr. Zarif and his delegation receiving their visas follows directly after President Trump saying that he would like to see everyone in that delegation be admitted into the U.S. ahead of the General Assembly. And it's interesting to note that the certain members were excluded on that might have previously been allowed to come to the United States to attend the General Assembly on the basis of their ties to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which, as you know, the Trump administration had labeled a foreign terrorist organization as part of their maximum pressure campaign. In terms of whether Mr. Trump will probably meet with Mr. Rouhani, there is always that possibility that a secret meeting could occur. But there's also reporting that Rouhani himself may not even attend the General Assembly. So what we could keep an eye out for is the possibility of Trump meeting with Zarif, which I say is possible, considering if we want to take President Macron of France's word for it, Trump was aware of Zarif's presence at the recent G7 summit. So if that is the closest Trump may get to getting a diplomatic off-ramp to these current very high tensions, we should keep in mind that he might meet with the foreign minister instead of the president, at least at this moment.
Okay. Hamid, I wanted to go back to for a moment. Hamid, again, the point that I was making with you in my previous question to you about the U.S. removing itself from the affairs of the Middle East region. Do you think that when we talk about diplomacy, and I'm going to use an example of something that occurred not too long ago, in fact, within this region, at the height of the Strait of Hormuz tensions, Hamid, as you may remember, a UAE official, military official, I believe it was, met an Iranian military official, and they came to some sort of an understanding about security of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf region. Do you think that that is in many ways significant in the sense that if regional countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, and others are left to their own devices, that they can actually genuinely talk it out and come to some sort of an understanding?
Indeed, yeah, it has happened and it will happen. But we have a problem in the Middle East, that is Israel, because Israel has not been accepted by Middle Eastern countries, and the United States supports Israel come what may. And this is a problem for the Middle East and a problem for America. As long as America supports Israel in total support without any reservation, without any questioning of Israel's policy, especially under Netanyahu. It's not going to be looked at as an even or a fair player in Middle Eastern politics. So the U.S. Is regarded as biased by all Middle Eastern countries, at least by the people. Regardless of what the government's positions are, the people think that the United States is not fair. It is biased towards Israel, and this is a fact. It's not just what people think. So as long as Israel is there, the U.S. will get involved. It cannot remove itself from the region because of its relations with Israel, its close relations with Israel, which makes people think that the U.S. is really anti-Islam, anti-Arab, Middle East. So the U.S. has a problem, and unless it really rectifies its position with regard to Israel, it will always have a problem in the Middle East.
Okay, so Alexandros, do you think then, in sum, that Israel and or the U.S. will actually go to war with Iran at some point?
I personally think that if we're talking about an all-out war, the experience that the United States has had in Iraq and in Afghanistan they have been imprinted in the minds not only of the American public, but also in the minds of the political establishment within the United States. And in order for President Trump to actually have the capacity to mount such a war, he would need a bipartisan support. I'm pretty sure that not all Republicans would be willing to provide him with such a support. And I also do not think that Israel by itself would actually move forward and conduct war against Iran on its own. So what I think would happen most likely would be maybe some sort of a counter-strike of similar caliber if the United States chooses to use a military option to answer against the attacks that happened last week. But in general, I believe that it's not a very viable option.
All right, very well. We'll leave there as our final word, gentlemen. But of course, we appreciate all three of you for your time and your insight. That was Nicholas speaking to us from New York, Alexandros from Cyprus, and Hamid from London. Viewers, as our guests are mentioned, the likelihood of war is actually quite low, despite the rhetoric. Of course, Iran saying it would defend itself if there were to be any strikes, and that would mean then all-out war in the region. That's what the Iranian foreign minister said. But it's important to note that Americans don't want to go to war with Iran at this time. They do not even support actually U.S. involvement in the Middle East region, seemingly, if we are to believe this poll. 1 in 4 of them saying that this is not what they would want going forward. But all of this, again, going back to the root cause of these current tensions that we're seeing, is the U.S. walking away from the Iran nuclear deal. Now, yes, we can argue about if it is Iran acting out because it feels itself in a corner. That, of course, is up for debate and should be discussed. But certainly, no one is arguing the root cause of all this. The U.S. chose to walk away from an internationally negotiated settlement or deal, however you want to term it, that does have other parties to it significantly, not just the U.S. So it's not like it was a bilateral agreement. It was a multilateral agreement, which the U.S. on its own decided to walk away from simply because it was an Obama negotiated settlement. That is what Trump has openly said. So that, again, has been the main cause of this tension between the Iran and the U.S. at this time. And again, this regional escalation that we're seeing. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now we're going to discuss the Council on American Islamic Relations releasing a report called the Bias Brief, which recorded a total of 10,015 anti-Muslim bias incidents since 2014. And the biggest spike occurred, I believe, in 2017, a 94% increase if compared to 2014. And certainly that all goes back, even in the report, there is an indication of this, to that quote-unquote Muslim ban, as it was known, about the travel restrictions placed on citizens of many Muslim countries around the world, and the effect that had about how people then perceive Muslims within the United States, be they citizens or otherwise just visitors. There have been incidents at mosques, 148 between the period of 2014 and 2019, were damaged or there was destruction caused to them through vandalism. And of course, we can go on and on about the different statistics and what this includes. It includes violent crime, for example, and physical harm, as well as employment discrimination. All of I should say. All of that, of course, very important when we talk about Islamophobia in the U.S. context, especially under Donald Trump. Let's discuss that further with our panelists. We're joined now by Zainab, who is the National Research and Advocacy Manager at the Council on American Islamic Relations. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. We're also joined by Sascha, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now via Skype from London. Sascha and Zainab, thank you both for your time this morning. Zainab, I'd like to start with you. This is quite an extensive report, of course, but what is the main takeaway, do you think, for yourself?
So this is something that we've done on an annual basis for the past couple of years, and we've seen a steady rise from 2014, as you mentioned. And you've already hit on the key point, which is that we've seen the greatest spike after Trump became president in 2017, and that was primarily because of the Muslim ban, in which multiple families, hundreds of families, were affected in trying to come into or out of the country. And that spike, though, or like the start of that initial incline from 2014 to now, we also know that anti-Muslim incidents spiked around election cycles, and around 2015 is when Trump when Trump and other candidates started the election run, and that's why there was that initial jump from 2014 to 2015. And given that the election cycle is in full swing again, and 2020 is next year, we're anticipating that numbers will again increase next year, unfortunately. And so the biggest takeaway from this is basically the negative and destructive effect that Trump has had on anti-Muslim incidents in the United States through his rhetoric and his behavior and his policies.
Now, of course, Sascha, you know what Donald Trump was all of that, saying that, listen, it's not his fault, that he has many Muslim friends. He's always spoken about that he's not racist, there isn't a racist bone in his body, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Waqar, first of all, I think you give a much more lucid description of what Trump would say than what Trump himself would say. We mostly get a stream of almost incomprehensible nonsense from him at this point. Yeah. What are we seeing with him? Well, I think you can talk about two things. Number one, he has definitely taken the lid off of public expressions of racism in America. I think, when you look at the rise of the right in America, when you look at the way he's legitimized racist discourse and used it himself, anyone who's had these feelings of hate against any group, be it women or Muslims, they feel that they can express their opinions more publicly and more openly, and that there's more people out there who will join with him. But as a historian of culture in America, I think we should also look at this in a slightly longer term, which is that America as a culture has always thrived on the idea of opposition, that there's an enemy out there and an enemy inside the country itself that must be dealt with. And I think what we're really seeing here is the replacement of what was once the communist enemy with this new, much more imaginary Muslim enemy that is infiltrating American culture, that is a constant threat to American society, and that must be dealt with the most extreme measures. And there's there's almost no truth to that whatsoever, unlike the Cold War, where you actually did have a much more implacable opponent out there in the globe.
Indeed, and that's a good point, isn't it, Zainab, that if we're looking at this, in a wider lens, not just Donald Trump, for example, you'll remember, Zainab, of course, all those accusations, for example, I shouldn't even call it accusations, but the talk about, Obama possibly being Muslim, and then the lady who spoke to John McCain at the time about how Obama was Arab or Muslim. I don't remember which term she used at that time. And, then McCain said, no, he's a good man. So again, with that implication that Arab/Muslim is a bad thing, possibly. This has been growing for a while, hasn't it, Zainab?
Yes, it absolutely has. In fact, we can trace back sort of the recent rise in Islamophobia to around 2007, 2008, when there was a controversy around a mosque that was being built in New York. And the Islamophobia industry kind of leapt into that space and really became a national phenomenon. And from there, we've seen that it hasn't only been politicians like Donald Trump who have exacerbated that kind of sentiment and whipped up people into feeling emboldened to act on their bias through various acts of vandalism or harassment or intimidation or even hate crimes, but also individuals or organizations within the Islamophobia network that spread lies, that advance misinformation, that, advance policies and laws to try to demonize Muslims in the public sphere. And earlier this year, we actually released another report called Hijacked by Hate, which documented how this network, the Islamophobia industry, has received over $1.5 billion in funding over the course of 3 years, and how that money is flowing into targeting American Muslim communities, into abusing the legal system by passing policies that affect American Muslims. And so it is definitely a much broader issue and has had a much longer history. And I also want to point out that something that the professor mentioned is that we've seen this rise in the US, but we've also seen this rise in Europe, right? And so Islamophobia, like he said, isn't just an isolated thing, right? It's connected to white nationalism and white supremacy. And there's these intersections that occur and kind of fuel one another.
Those other incidents around the world, outside of course US borders, again, Christchurch, Norway, and otherwise, and possibly Finsbury Park, for example, in London. Do you think that there is an understanding, Zainab, of course within your organization, about the global effect of what occurs and what starts possibly in the US, and how it's important then to deal with this ASAP?
I think there is definitely an understanding of how international events affect one another. So after the New Zealand massacre, for example, our organization, was in kind of like, it was in a, what's the word? I can't remember, but not like a panic mode, but just very like vigilant and ready for anything that may happen on American soil, right? That targeted American Muslims. And so we ramped up our connections with American mosques to provide training, safety trainings, or connect them to organizations that would provide mosque safety trainings, right? And we started having conversations about if a shooter comes into your mosque, what's going to happen? Who should you contact? What do safety measures look like? Yeah. And so those sorts of incidents, unfortunately, do have international repercussions. And shooters in New Zealand are affecting the ideologies of shooters in America, and the ideologies of American shooters are affecting ideologies of shooters in New Zealand or Europe or elsewhere. And so it is definitely this globalized sort of idea or ideology that you can say is pushing these people to this sort of behavior.
Sascha, what do you make of nationalization of this sort of hate? Because, it seems that they sort of work off of each other, as Zainab there was saying. So, people who, for example, are part of this Islamophobia network, if I may argue for that term, then would get, inspiration from what occurred in New Zealand or vice versa. If there's been another incident in the US, that's sort of then a vicious cycle, right? How does one break that then?
Well, it's very difficult to break, and I think it's very apt to identify it as a global phenomena. I think even broader than Islamophobia, we can really identify it as the rise from dormancy or obscurity of white nationalism, and you see it from Norway to Australia to the U.S. Even you have incidents in Canada, which is not a country known for racist violence, at least against anything but their own First Nations people. And our other commentators are quite right to say that you have explicit references to statements and manifestos issued by people in one area, used in attacks and quoted by attackers in other areas. And the one that comes up a lot actually is Anders Breivik, who committed the massacre in Norway. And when it comes to the Muslim population, I think what you really had is a fusion of general anti-immigrant sentiment, which again I think is white nationalist sentiment, into anti-Muslim sentiment, so that all immigrants, or the most dangerous immigrants, are always identified as Muslim immigrants. And those are the ones that everyone really needs to be worried about. And whatever qualities are ascribed completely incorrectly to Muslim immigrants are then ascribed to all immigrants coming into that country. So they all become potential terrorists. They all become potential criminals. They all become potential extremists. And the fallacy of it is really obvious. Anyone who looks at the numbers that many immigrants are women and children who have no particular political ideology to begin with.
So then, Sascha, sticking with you, what do you think is the solution? Because many people talk about the need for then more engagement on the part of the Muslim community with the greater populations, but then that puts seemingly the onus back onto the very community which is being quote unquote targeted.
Yes, well, I would say there's really two solutions. One is the simplest one, and one is the more complex and difficult one. The simple one is the record of immigration through history, especially in the modern period, shows us that time always facilitates acceptance and assimilation. When we look at the terms that are used, the language that's used, and a lot of the ideas that were used, violence, cultural appropriation, so on and so forth, we can see that being used against a whole host of immigrant groups going back 2 centuries. You see it being used against Jewish immigrants in the 1880s and 1890s. We can see it being used against Irish immigrants in the mid-19th century. So what happens over time is as the groups that are coming in adopt more of the cultural practices or integrate their own cultural practices with those of the host nations, the differences become much less obvious. So one solution is just patience and time and understanding, and hopefully the angels of our better nature. The other is much more intractable, which is that to talk about engagement or maybe countering some of the myths that are around there, we have to have a common source and understanding of what truth is in media and in news reporting. And right now we don't have it. We are in this sort of post-truth age where people can get whatever biases they have confirmed, and they can ignore the more factual, objective accounts. In fact, one of the real secrets to Trump's success and popularity is his undermining of the more reliable news stories as being the lamestream media, the biased media, that's really where the bias is. And you would only get truth from him. We have to attack that, and we have to sort of convince people to seek more reliable sources.
Of course. Zainab, I wonder what your thoughts are then when it comes to trying to tackle the situation on the part of Cair and otherwise. I'm sure that there are, of course, programs of engagement as well. But what else do you think needs to be done from the other side? I mean, I imagine that the media and otherwise don't really help the situation most of the time, do they?
The media is definitely a mixed bag. I think that it does do a lot of good work in a lot of ways, but then you have mainstream outlets, having headlines that frame Muslims a very particular way. Everyone knows the dichotomy of lone white male shooter kind of deal, like lone wolf idea. And then oh my God, this terrorist inspired brown man who's Muslim, right? So there's definitely that stereotype that the media puts out. But with regards to, I mentioned, the other commentator mentioned Anders Breivik as someone that a lot of these, shooters or people who are violently pursuing white nationalism cite. And what's interesting is in his manifesto, he cited a few of the people in the Islamophobia network, notably Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller. And those two individuals are huge in the Islamophobia industry, and they do nothing but advance anti-Muslim rhetoric and ideas and policies. And so kind of trying to cut at that, the only real way forward is to prevent them from being funded, right? And so one of the things that our organization is trying to do is the 1.5 billion that I mentioned earlier is, where is that money coming from? How is that money flowing into literally hate groups, right? That's purpose is nothing but to advance hate toward a particular people. And so we're working with philanthropies in the country to figure out how they can divest from hate groups, how charities are being used and abused by hate groups taking advantage of nonprofit status to basically pursue their hateful aims.
That's a good point, isn't it, Sascha? Because I imagine that it's not just hate for the sake. I mean, someone's getting rich off of all of this, seemingly. The likes of Pamela Geller and others, we can probably add quite a few names to that list, as I'm sure you well know. So why not then go after their funding, as Zainab there said?
Oh, absolutely. And I think to point to the sort of commercial side of this is a very astute observation. This is fear is an excellent sales pitch. And by ramping up fear against one particular group, there are a lot of people that are making money off this. And there's whole news channels that are devoting, Fox News is one of them, that are devoting immense amounts of content towards ginning up that hate and encouraging it. And as much as the American laws on anti-hate speech and anti-bias speech allow it, I think absolutely going after these groups in the courts, going after the money, going after the sources of funding, convincing or other ancillary organizations that are benefiting from this in a in a more indirect way, convincing them to reject that funding. I think that is absolutely key. The problem is that you're going to run afoul of free speech laws, and anytime you do that, a whole nother group that's attached to this, in part to this movement, then they come to the fore and say, whoa, that's the untouchable thing. Like you have to allow a certain level of free discourse, and any limitation on speech is an unwelcome limitation, is a transgression of constitutional rights. So it's a very delicate line to walk to cut that funding and to try to attack the sources of this bias speech without transgressing that line.
Zainab, that's an important point as well. Also, I'm not saying, of course, Sascha is saying that we shouldn't be clamping down on hate speech, but, the argument of free speech is something that's brought up often, as you well know, Zainab, I'm sure. Are Muslims, are American Muslims, let me just directly ask you this, afraid of having conversations about Islam, about openly discussing any criticisms that anyone in the United States may have of Muslims/Islam?
Oh, absolutely not. I think critical engagement is absolutely necessary. However, there's a difference between wanting to engage for actual understanding, right? Whether or not you agree at the end is a side issue. You don't have to agree, right? However, there's a difference between that and just, attacking without a common shared purpose of trying to gain an understanding, right? And the distinction between hate speech and free speech, I think, is very key as well, because, it is a fine line, but we have to realize that, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? And when people are making, for example, comments through social media networks or, on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, those comments and that kind of speech is having real life impacts on people's lives, right? People are being murdered over this, idea of free speech. And so we have to recognize that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and to hold this concept of free speech in, a bubble and divorce it from the real life harm that it's inflicting on people, we really need to weigh where our priorities are over there, right? And so we do, as a society, at least in America, have to contend with that distinction. And we see right now how social media providers, whether it's like media platforms or even internet service providers, are contending with the difficulty of drawing the line. And last week or earlier this week, Facebook actually decided that they were going to institute a sort of Supreme Court of their own to determine content moderation standards, right? So it's something that is affecting all aspects of our society, and because we recognize it's having real life harm towards communities.
Indeed. All right, we're going to leave that as a final word, but of course we appreciate Zainab and Sascha for their time this morning and for, of course, their insight on this important topic. Viewers, as I said, we were discussing there the bias brief, a report released by Cair, the Council on American Islamic Relations, about how Islamophobia has increased, especially since Donald Trump has come into office. But it's not like something that was not existent before that as well, especially in the wake of 9/11 and even since 2007 onwards, as Zainab there pointed out. It's important to note, as Zainab there said, and there are books out there detailing the Islamophobia network that exists, those people getting rich over promoting hate, and the amounts of money that they make really just to promote hate towards Muslims or even other minority groups in the United States and worldwide. And again, this is a very global issue. It's not limited to the U.S., but I would argue that whatever happens in the U.S. or what starts in the U.S. does then seem to spread across the world. As we can see with Islamophobia and the attacks at Finsbury Park in London, we can talk about Christchurch, we can talk about Norway, we can talk about many parts of the world, even now Canada, as Sascha had said, a country which prides itself seemingly on how multicultural it is now seeing a resurgence of white nationalist groups who are very hateful towards Muslims and other minorities as well. We'll keep a close eye on this disturbing trend, which seems to be only growing. And again, this is now next year, an election year in the US, so we'll wait and see if this only gets worse then. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.